as an invocation for our session and the upcoming Dia de los Muertos. Image. I find you, Lord, in all things and in all my fellow creatures, pulsing with your life. As a tiny seed, you sleep in what is small, and in the vast, you vastly yield yourself. The wondrous game that power plays with things is to move in such submission through the world, groping in roots, growing thick in trunks, and in branches like a rising of the dead. And I chose this poem because it is about regeneration and emergence, and it talks about the humility of a seed, its intrinsic power and its near infinite potential. It's about how we grope our own way instinctively towards the light, sensing some all-pervading spiritual force that supports our ascent. And I'd like to talk about the regeneration of the earth and the human community, and how these intersect in a time of great crisis and great opportunity. We've reached a collective evolutionary bottleneck. Scientists say we have 15 years or less to turn around the current climate crisis and preserve our planet's web of life and the global society that depends on it. And we who are gathered here today in Monterey understand that the world really is in our hands, and we have the power to change it. Do you agree? Do we? The people in this room can change this. Can we bring everything that we are, rational and intuitive, head and heart, human resources and financial ones, skill sets, networks, our dreams and our values, and with a high sense of seriousness and a high sense of fun, can we build together a compassionate ecological civilization? Today, in the era of digitally super-empowered individuals and infinitely interconnected global networks and new platforms to combine our efforts, what is there to stop us? Now, this is not to say that there are not forces that are arrayed against positive change. And here, justice, the theme of this conference, must prevail. We must place the balance of nature firmly on the scales, knowing that the fate of human civilization depends on it. The ultimate justice is a regenerative justice, committed to the thriving of both people and planet, defending the very web of life. It must strive to make whole a broken and unsustainable global paradigm. It must practice what Judaism calls tikkun olam, the repair of the world. We need a justice rooted in the fact, confirmed by the science of ecology and evolution and quantum physics and ancient spiritual traditions, that we truly are one. If I harm you, I harm myself. If I do harm to the environment, the climate, the endangered species, I harm our children and the future children and everything that we cherish. So we need a whole systems justice, in the spirit of a remark once made by Buckminster Fuller when he was asked, where do you start to solve a problem? And he looked at the interlocutor and he said, well, of course it's obvious. You start with the universe. Now, it's hard to start with the universe sometimes when we're faced with even one person suffering, let alone that of billions. Like many of you, I could cite chapter and verse on how disparities of class and power and race and money drive poverty, hunger, conflict, and the climate crisis. How an unjust political, military, economic, and social order continues to sell our common future for the short-term gains of the few. I could talk about how the mega crisis of climate change disproportionately impacts the poorest countries and the most fragile communities, and how commercial interests and political expedients still decimate the forests on which we and all of nature depend for the very breath of life. I could point out that the failure of governments to take resolute action means that the ice cover in the Arctic Sea this year hit a new low, shrinking to 500,000 square miles less than normal. While every one of the past 14 months has broken the global temperature record, and those who have contributed the least to climate change are already suffering its greatest effects. We're at the very edge of our ability to alter the converging destructive processes and negative feedback loops that we have in our profligacy and our ignorance set into inexorable motion. Yet there's a powerful momentum of hope today. There are ever stronger laws against the despoliation of the global commons, our land, water, air, species. The nations that gathered in Paris last fall agreed to decarbonize the world economy, and may they follow through on their promises. Ecopreneurs are starting new ventures that try to bring economy and ecology into harmony. Renewable energies, rapidly falling prices and deployment mean the world could be 20% wind-powered by the year 2030, reducing carbon dioxide emissions by more than 3.3 billion tons a year. And if the world could awaken to the greater opportunity, 100 times that amount of CO2 could be sequestered in trees, soils, and eco-agriculture in ways that bring regenerative justice to the powerless, the hungry, and the impoverished. I believe the time is right to declare an audacious and achievable goal to re-green the world in one generation for all the generations to come. The time has come to work together for a new regenerative society that includes regenerative agriculture, regenerative economics, regenerative education, regenerative culture. And that includes a justice that goes beyond remediation or restitution or even restoration to transformation. Only then will the current Anthropocene era, the era of the sixth great extinction, become the regenerative age. This will require an applied paradigm shift. It was Einstein who said problems cannot be solved at the same level of awareness that created them. We know that if we try to solve today's crises with an old mindset, we will perpetuate the same patterns that got us into this mess. And many new paradigms are arising to describe this new framework for a holistic, compassionate, mindful action that is at once personal, social, and global. The Dalai Lama calls it universal responsibility. The Pope calls it integral ecology. Martin Luther King called it the beloved community. I would call it simply green compassion, to describe an active, embracing concern for the mutual thriving of both people and planet. Embracing Einstein's view as a man who peered into the heart of the cosmos and saw deeply into the cosmos of the human heart, I wanted to read for you a saying, a passage that I think should be posted on every wall in every office and home and institution on the planet, because it really sums it up. And he said, "A human being is part of the whole called by us universe. He experiences himself, his thoughts, and his feelings as something separate from the rest, a kind of optical delusion of consciousness. This restricts us to our personal desires and to affection for a few people nearest to us. Our task must be to free ourselves from this prison by widening our circle of compassion to embrace all creatures and the whole of nature in its beauty." What Einstein is talking about here is compassion as both a universal principle and a personal practice. He's saying our real enemy is the axis of ego, the deluded dualistic mentality that separates self from others. He says we must extend the love that we feel to our dearest ones in ever-widening ripples to all people. He insists that we can each work to free ourselves from the imprisoning self-centeredness that's our all-too-human default position. And he says that compassion must extend to the natural world, not just because of its utility, but its power to stir the soul and make fertile the human imagination. So that all of this doesn't sound like a bunch of abstract, high-flown rhetoric, I'd like to ground it in my own story. 10 years ago, I published a book called The Compassionate Life, and I was gratified that it had some wide impact, but the most surprising effect was on my own life. I found that the stories that I'd put down on the page had gotten deeply under my skin. I'd written about a man who had given a stranger in need not just his spare change, but his spare kidney. I wrote about another man who had forgiven his daughter's murderer and sat down with a survivor of the Rwandan genocide who had befriended the man who had massacred his parents. They had shown me in the flesh and up close the truth of Martin Luther King's saying, "We are all caught in an inescapable web of mutuality." And I decided to put aside my writing career and try to do something tangible for the world. Head still in the stars, but feet on the ground and fingers in the dirt. But what to do? What to do? I had no guide, but a certain inchoate sense of goodness. On one day on my roundabout quest, I met a man who planted trees according to the ancient method of agroforestry. When I learned more about this way to feed people and heal the environment by combining crops and forests, a light went on. This was green compassion, a way to help both people and planet. This began an unplanned, decade-long experiment, trying to see how one person with a handful of others might apply the values that so many of us here ascribe to, compassion, mindfulness, creativity, holism, and apply them to solving real-world problems. I wanted to address our convergent ecological and human crises in ways that were generative and optimistic and healing, not just adversarial, not just doom and gloom. And I wanted to explore the connection between the life of the spirit and the fate of the earth. I was invited to visit Ethiopia, the birthplace of humanity, where once a terrible famine had inspired one of the great global relief concerts called Live Aid. Some of you may remember this. Local leaders told me that though the world's magnanimity had poured into their country, it had little lasting effect on the lives of people subsisting at the bottom of the pyramid on a landscape now down to 1% of its former tree cover. I learned that the problem was a vicious cycle, that poor people cut down trees in fragile forests out of dire need to sell for cash or building materials or to use as fuel for smoky cooking and heating fires that contribute to climate change. The treeless soils erode, they become infertile, and with the poor farming methods, arable land and food supply diminish, and aquifers and rainfall dwindle. The conflicts over resources begin to arise, and the impoverished land swells the tide of human migration from rural villages to urban slums. I saw firsthand how the problems the world faces are inextricably connected. Poverty, hunger, ignorance, deforestation, conflict, climate change, all of it. I also learned something else in Ethiopia, though, and that is that regeneration is possible. The local people wanted desperately to restore the lush landscapes some of them could still remember. And they would talk to me in tears about the stories that their grandparents had told them. They wanted the world that had been lost to be restored, and they were willing to work for it very hard. I visited a village where a well had been broken, and the water now had parasites, so that the children of the village had to walk miles every day to fetch uncontaminated water. And I was struck that they always used some of what they lugged back in these heavy jerry cans to water the trees that they planted on a hillside. And my first good deed was to fix that well. And then I helped to start a regeneration project in Ethiopia that I called Bees and Trees. The community planted these calandra trees to prevent erosion and enrich the degraded soil. But the trees also had big, beautiful, juicy red blossoms that were favored by honeybees. So this increased the yields at the community honey hives and also pollinated the coffee crops. And this created an economic incentive for the villages to plant even more trees. And I realized that green compassion meant essentially that everything is connected to everything. Everything. You had to consider all inputs, upstream, downstream, internal and external, all stakeholders from people to soil microbes as part of an overall solution. So I started an organization called the Green World Campaign. And it was really begun with what entrepreneurs call a big, hairy, audacious goal. The goal was to regreen the world in one generation. Why not? I've been amazed that through sincere intention and a lot of synchronicity and long years of stubborn volunteer labor, this quixotic-sounding experiment has succeeded. The Green World Campaign has now worked in 6 countries on 3 continents, helping communities to plant millions of trees and hardy, nutritious crops to renew degraded land, alleviate poverty, increase food security, and provide climate change resilience. We next worked with the Mexican organization Naturalia. Some of you may know them. We worked in the San Juan Atzingo forest in Puebla, helping one of the world's last Tlahuica-speaking villages replant a sacred oyamel forest that had been decimated by illegal logging. We helped high school kids in Jordan plant the seeds of justice. In Mindanao, in the Philippines, a former conflict zone, we supported an agroforestry system of seedbed nurseries, gardens, herbs, fruit and forest trees, cocoa, pili nut, moringa, mahogany, coconut, and coffee. We finally put down deep roots in Kenya, where we've now planted 1 million trees. We've helped spiritual elders to restore the sacred Kaya forests that it turns out are also biodiversity hotspots, so strengthening at the same time traditional culture and ecological integrity. Working on a shoestring or less, we've had greater success than organizations literally 100 times our size, and I think this is because we've practiced holistic green compassion. The Green World Campaign in Kenya now has 100 school programs where 40,000 kids are planting hundreds of thousands of biodiverse trees, improving their own nutrition while learning about global citizenship and conflict resolution. These children actually helped start a nationwide Green World Peace movement that, under the banner Plant Trees, Harvest Peace, has helped reconcile tribal conflict across the country. Tens of thousands of kids who pass through these programs in turn influence hundreds of thousands of community members. They show their parents the new multi-purpose saplings and knowledge that they get in the schools, and their subsistence communities start to grow drought-resistant trees like the moringa, which I'd first encountered in Ethiopia, and whose leaves are an astonishing 30% high-quality protein. Over the past 3 years, moringa trees have spread from Green World schoolyards to farmers across the Kenyan coastal region who've planted hundreds of thousands of them, providing nutrition, income, useful seed oil, and climate change resilience. No village that plants moringa will ever starve. It turns out that this agroforestry approach is happening all over the world, with Mexico playing a leading role. The Lacandan forest people near Chiapas still tend complex, sustainable forest gardens, as did their Mayan ancestors. Unlike today's environmentalists, they don't draw a red line between the land where people belong and nature where they don't belong. What has been thought of as primitive jungle agriculture turns out to be a sophisticated way, and really maybe the way of the future, to conserve biodiversity and rich soil while producing bountiful, varied, and super nutritious foodstuffs. In the system called milpas, as many as 80 species can be cultivated on a single hectare. The managed forests of the Huastec Maya in the northeast are packed with up to 300 plant species, most with food and/or medicinal uses. So here's a really serious suggestion, if I may be so bold. Why doesn't Mexico, with its modern scientific and economic expertise, its brilliant heritage of traditional knowledge and practice, implement a massive program of ecological development that would protect natural areas, encourage biodiverse agriculture, sequester carbon, and lead the world into the age of regeneration? It can happen. It should happen. Viva. Si se puede. Yeah. This project in Odisha, India, another place where this is happening, as it is all over the world, is a powerful example of regenerative justice. These eco-agricultural systems also strengthen community determination. And the Scottish government is supporting this tribal community to strengthen agroecology practices in order to break the cycle of food insecurity, strengthen social bonds, increase livelihoods, and improve the status of women. La Via Campesina consists of 150 organizations from 73 countries, representing 200 million small farmers who practice regenerative agriculture. That's how big and widespread this movement is becoming. These people must often struggle for their rights and their community integrity in the face of multinational corporations that run an industrial food system, companies that make huge profits from seeds linked to patented chemical fertilizers and pesticides. And despite the fact that this global system of industrial agriculture causes soil depletion and loss of species and inequity, and is itself responsible for at least 1/4 of all greenhouse gas emissions into the atmosphere, it's claimed that these methods are the only choice to secure the high yields needed to feed the planet. However, studies have now shown that regenerative farming, from organic agriculture to permaculture to agroecology, actually increases crop yields over the long term, as well as fertile, healthy soil that holds moisture and draws down carbon from the atmosphere. The conflict here is not just about method, but values. One worldview sees the soil as an object from which to extract maximum financial profit at all costs. The other sees the soil as a living organism within an interdependent ecosystem that encompasses both people and planet. So here is a proposal for regenerative justice that could actually save the world. Support and defend the world's 500 million resource-poor small farmers to cultivate regenerative agro-food systems that could help feed the world and store vast amounts of carbon in healthy soil. This can be done. Of course, the industrial system is also proposing its own solutions for the accelerating climate crisis. Technologies on the drawing board against potentially runaway climate change include massively costly geoengineering projects like giant space mirrors to deflect the sun, or pumping sulfuric acid aerosols into the stratosphere to reflect sunlight back into space, or deploying ocean-based cloud brightening platforms. But I've heard recently there's a lot of buzz about an alternative technology. It's said that it runs on solar energy, and it absorbs CO2, and it emits oxygen, and it produces food. And it has been field tested for 360 million years. Planting trees and restoring degraded land remains the best means currently known for removing the excess of planet-heating CO2 now clogging the atmosphere. And this brings up another climate change peril. The heating of the planet will reduce world agricultural production by 2% each decade. I read this in an article in the New York Times, which added that this will necessitate carving out new agricultural land by cutting down more trees and forests. So here is a perfect lose-lose proposition. Less life-sustaining, biodiverse, climate change mitigating forest land, and more soil-killing, climate change-inducing tracts of chemicalized monocrop industrial agriculture. Brilliant, a brilliant solution. But I think we can do better. I think if we looked at the crisis and the opportunity through our regenerative eyeglasses, we'd come to a different conclusion of what the possibilities might be. The United Nations data shows that 5 billion acres of degraded land worldwide could be restored through agroecology and other methods that benefit people and planet. And here's a factoid. Regenerative farming on just 9% of global farmland on slopes and hillsides, generally considered marginal, could greatly increase food supply and sequester 1/3 of all human-caused annual carbon emissions. The critical mission to somehow draw down CO2 from the air is too little discussed. Because even if we stopped emitting CO2 from every tailpipe and every smokestack on the planet tomorrow, the excess carbon already in the atmosphere from a century of industrial activity will continue to cause further global warming for a century or more. But some very recent studies indicate that increasing the carbon-rich humus content of soils worldwide by just 10% over the next 50 years could reduce atmospheric CO2 to, hear this, pre-industrial levels. And what builds and conserves healthy soil the best? Surprise, regenerative agriculture. Has many names: agroforestry, eco-agriculture, agroecology, biodiverse perennial agriculture, permaculture, organic agriculture, call it what we like. But a study in the journal Nature recently estimated that up to 80% of fossil fuel emissions could be captured by such soil-smart methods, which also produce far healthier food. What's not to like about this equation? Sometimes I think that the lingering in the back of the Western mind is a kind of a tree phobia, call it agoraphobia, a fear of primeval nature, rampant, proliferative, resistant to orderly rectilinear control. Or maybe too many of us read the story of The Little Prince when we were kids, with its nightmare of a small planet destroyed by giant overgrown baobab trees, which in reality are actually fantastic agroforestry trees. Let's not let fear of monster baobabs or anything else stop us from trying a great regenerative experiment to re-green the world in one generation. This, to my mind, is the perfect class project for 21st century global citizens. And you may well ask, is it even possible, such a gigantic task? I think it is. Here are the denuded heathlands of Sweden 100 years ago. And here are those same heathlands today, the heathlands of Sweden. Yeah. And here is the Shinyanga region, known as the desert of Tanzania, where trees were once cleared to eradicate the tsetse fly. Here it is today. 500,000 hectares of new forest, 1.5 million hectares of new agroforestry done by small farmers, and a regenerative strategy that, by the way, has empowered women, despite the appearance of this photo, and has doubled rural income. 20 years ago, southern Niger was desertifying. It was written off by all the development agencies until satellites detected that there was a mysterious outbreak of green on the landscape. And when they investigated, they discovered that farmers had rediscovered the simple farming methods of their ancestors, especially cultivating a tree called the gao tree, which helps fertilize the soil and is synergistic with traditional crops. Of course, they sort of co-evolved. So instead of clearing saplings from their fields before planting, as they learned from European agriculture, they now protect and nurture them and carefully plow around them. Small farmers have created at least 8 million newly tree-covered acres. The New York Times was greatly amazed when it wrote, "This shows how relatively small changes in human behavior can transform regional ecology, restoring its biodiversity and its productivity." So here's a good one. This Indian civil servant, one C.M. Raju, decided he wanted to break the Guinness Book of World Records for the most trees planted in one day. So he devised a way to employ 300,000 villagers from 7,500 villages to do a mass tree planting in exchange for state poverty funds. He knew where all the pots of money were, and he decided to repurpose them very cleverly. And the BBC reported his claim that on August 30th, 2009, he came close to his target of planting 1 billion trees in one day. 1 billion trees in one day. One guy with a crazy idea. Here is another one that's sort of mind-blowing. It's China's Los Plateau. And this is an area the size of France. It's 640,000 square kilometers of the upper Yellow River, being massively restored by local farmers supported by state subsidies. Of course, China command and control economy can pull this sort of thing off. This video is by my friend John Liu. who notes that an agronomist can take a perfectly good piece of land and turn it into a desert in a few decades. But in just a few years, a permaculturist can take a desert and transform it back into a self-perpetuating, food-producing forest. Now, this is a quote from Yale professor Eric Tonesmeyer, who is firmly convinced that if implemented on a large scale, we can essentially terraform vast swaths of our planet into a food-producing paradise, sequestering at least 100 billion tons of carbon in the soil. And in this hopeful vision that he proposes, the millions of people around the world who are already doing the work of carbon farming by doing this kind of regenerative agriculture that puts carbon back in the soil would receive climate mitigation funds, and this in turn would ignite a massive movement to transform global agriculture. I think we need to go beyond the concept of sustainability, which, as essential as it is, still tends to be defined within existing unjust and unsustainable systems that equate the preservation of our natural and social capital with the security of financial capital and the existing dysfunctional institutions. Sustainability, as it tends to be practiced, too often leads to partial solutions and trade-offs that defer true justice and equity to the distance of a never-attainable dream. It allows the part of the system that's wreaking destruction to zero out the harm by making a positive entry on the other side of the balance sheet. One division of a sustainable company could make a profit digging a hole, and another division can make another profit by remedially filling in the same hole. In such a win-win scenario, symptoms may be healed, but the body is never restored to health. The stratagem may dampen the perturbations of the existing system, but the danger is it just keeps rolling along, albeit more slowly, right over the cliff. And I'll quote an ex-Wall Streeter, now a self-declared regenerative capitalist, apparently there are such things, named John Fullerton. And John says, "Natural systems thrive because they are regenerative. Sustainability is the outcome. It's not the design principle." I think that we're today seeing the signs of emergence of a regenerative society, a civilization whose activities and industries will function to restore and nourish the individual, society, and the environment in a constantly co-evolving synergy. Every institution can be reimagined in a regenerative framework. Justice at its best, said Martin Luther King, is love correcting everything that stands against love. Think of South Africa's Truth and Reconciliation Commission, where the generative power of love was applied to the justice system in a way that changed that country and inspired the world. What would regenerative finance look like? John Fullerton again. He says, instead of viewing moral issues as irrelevant to rational economic decision-making, in regenerative capitalism, human and moral concerns become central to decision-making, and policymakers view those concerns as critical to the healthy whole. Regenerative education has been a goal of the Green World Campaign Eco Schools program, and we're now partnering with the Charter for Compassion to bring similar programs and international collaboration to the 400 compassionate cities and 3,500 schools, compassionate schools in their network. And I think you can fill in the blanks, regenerative industry, regenerative transportation, regenerative architecture, and even, yes, in this era of political madness, regenerative transpartisan politics. Every institution can be transformed. And there are, of course, spiritual dimensions to this project as well. I had the honor of presenting the Green World Charter to 10,000 religious leaders at the Parliament of the World's Religions last year. And I was amazed that there is a growing eco-spiritual movement defined by everything from Pope Francis's Laudato Si encyclical to the earth-cherishing indigenous traditions that have so long conserved the wisdom we now need to survive and to thrive on this planet. How many people are aware of this movement, the eco-spiritual movement? Yeah, it's remarkable. Not that much written about and spreading to every religious tradition in the world. Now, I've taken a crack at listing what I think are some core foundational principles for a regenerative society, and you'll no doubt have your own. And I see that the clock seems to be running out, so I'll just say that this list is partial and one that I'm inviting people to contribute to. But it's based on net positives and negative entropy. In other words, the more the information flow increases in the system, the better the system functions. It's holistic. It nourishes the entire web of life in which humanity is an integral part. It's transformational, not just tinkering with quick fixes to mitigate harms, but shifting the system from destructive operations to beneficial ones. It's compassionate, brings self and other into the same circle, so it's a holistic perspective. It's inclusive. It's a coalition of everybody. It has a higher purpose to heal people and planet. Can that be the purpose of a civilization? I believe it can. Biomimicry, so it imitates the resilient and evolutionarily robust, decentralized, self-regenerating systems of nature. Collaborative, which means rather than competition, this is the survival mechanism of all natural systems. It takes a long view for the generations to come. And it's creative. It promotes the innovative powers of human culture and human potential, and the perspectives of art and play are applied, even to the hard problems. So many faith traditions, as I said, have become part of this movement, and that, I think, is a central need for the spiritual core and our individual spiritual practice to inform the environmental work and the social work that we do. I think that's the purpose of this conference. I also think media plays an important role. Could we have arts and media that actually are regenerative and can include people in generative solutions? So it's not just sort of reporting and not just doing sort of abstract art, but art that maybe can bring everybody into a collective practice and process. This was something we did in Times Square on Earth Day, and it actually enabled people to text TREE and plant trees in villages in Kenya. We're also starting our own regenerative industry based on superfood moringa trees, whose leaves are high-quality protein with all essential amino acids. They can survive on degraded land with little water, and the areas where it grows best actually happen to be the areas where the greatest poverty and hunger are. So we think that there can be a large-scale industry that grows out of this. We're beginning it in Nigeria to transform West Africa. And I'm working now with a man who used to run the operations for Kraft Food. And he had a near-death experience, and he decided that what he really wanted to do was work with the poor. And these are representatives of some of the 400,000 farmers that we recruited to grow moringa trees using biodiverse perennial agriculture. And these are people who are part of the Igbo spiritual tradition, whose slogan is life to all life, kind of the ultimate biophilia. So this is where my experiment's taken me so far, which seems to have unfolded with its own blueprint that I never saw, and I certainly didn't create. I just opened my heart and mind. I tried to bring my whole being into this party and showed up for synchronicity and followed truth and beauty and listened for authentic inner promptings and did my best to make the invisible visible. I know that asking daily, what does the universe want, is not a stupid question. And inevitably, according to its own inscrutable timing, the universe will answer. This approach may sound idiosyncratic, but I know I'm not walking alone in this. I think that everyone in the room knows the potential power of each thought, each deed, to influence visibly and invisibly the most daunting reality. And I would just quote the heroic dissident artist, Chinese artist Ai Weiwei, who once said, "Imagine one day that the hateful world around you collapses, and it is actually your attitude, words, and actions that put an end to it. Will you be excited? Well, will you?"
Agradecemos a Marc Barasch por su presentación. Invitamos a Lupana Velasco, vicepresidenta de la Federación Nacional de Asociaciones y Clubes de Jardinería, para que nos acompañe en la entrega del reconocimiento. Por favor.